Hello and welcome to Tata Literature Live 2022 in association with the NCPA, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Titan, powered by Godrej and Kotak. This session is sponsored by Godrej. We are on the second day of the online edit of Tata Literature Live 2022 because this year, your favorite international literature festival takes on a combined format, both online and thank God, finally offline. We have had 2 days of the online version, yesterday and today, and then those in and around Bombay. Remember, you can join us for the physical version of the festival opening on ground tomorrow, Friday, November 11th, and then continuing through the weekend at besides the NCPA at the St. Paul's Institute of Communication Education and the Tidal Waves bookstore additionally. Remember to check out our website, tatalitlive.in, for the full schedule of sessions and speakers. I look forward to seeing you all there on ground and in person because I'll be there too. Now, on to our third online session for today, Unbelonging, Perpetual Strangers in a New Land. In The Ungrateful Refugee, What Immigrants Never Tell You, Dina Nayeri asks, what is it like to be a refugee? It is a question many of us do not give much thought to, and yet there are more than 25 million refugees in the world. To be a refugee is to grapple with your place in society, attempting to reconcile the life you have known with a new, unfamiliar home. All of this while bearing the burden of gratitude in your host nation. The expectation that you should be forever thankful for the space that you have been allowed. Discussing the journey of a refugee from a grateful visitor to a nationalized citizen, please welcome our first speaker today. Dina Nayeri, a refugee herself, is the author of 2 novels and a book of creative nonfiction. The Ungrateful Refugee, winner of many awards and called by The Guardian a work of astonishing, insistent importance. Dina has won a National Endowment for the Arts Literature Grant, the O. Henry Prize, and Best American Short Stories, amongst a host of other honors. Her work has been published in more than 20 countries and in publications such as the New York Times, Washington Post, and Granta, amongst a bunch of other publications. Her short dramas have been produced by the English Touring Theatre and the Old Vic in London. She's currently working on plays, screenplays, and nonfiction books, as well as a novel. She's recently joined the permanent faculty at the University of St. Andrews. She will be in conversation with Dr. Nader Fekri, who is a visiting professor of politics at the University of Mumbai and is also a member of the Board of Trustees at the American School of Bombay. He was born in Iran, but as a child moved to the UK, which has been his home for 50 years. He has worked as a TV journalist, a justice of the peace, a mayor, but primarily as an academic. He has taught politics in universities in the UK and across Europe. Remember, you can contribute your questions for the Q&A that will happen at the end of this session by writing in your questions in the comment boxes of the platform that you are viewing us on. And remember to send in your names as well. Now, over to you, Mrs. Nayeri and Dr. Fekri for Unbelonging, Perpetual Strangers in a New Land.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and hello, Dina. I'm delighted to be sharing this session with you. I've long been a fan of your writing. I think it's an astonishing tour de force, moving, joyful, upsetting. I have a whole range of emotions. I sometimes feel like those chameleons that run across a plant at top. So quickly onto a few words of introduction. I don't know whether I'm supposed to do this or whether you'd like to do this yourself. As you know yourself better, I guess it should be over to you. So Dina, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Should I introduce myself? Well, thank you guys for having me. Thank you for those kind words, Nader. I really appreciate it so much. And I also appreciate you, being up so early since, we're all in different parts of the world, aren't we? So my name is Dina Nayeri. I'm a writer of fiction and nonfiction. I write essays and short stories as well as books. And my last book was called The Ungrateful Refugee, which was a mix of memoir and reportage, as well as reflection on what it is to be a refugee.
Super. There's a couple of things that I'd like to talk to you about later on, but let's start with other people's books. What have you been reading in the last few weeks, months? What's been capturing your imagination?
Oh, wow. Right into, actually, I read a book recently that has me absolutely consumed for a couple of months. It's called When We Cease to Understand the World. Have you heard of it? I am now being very, very silly and forgetting the name of the author, but it's about the kind of inner world of these mathematicians of the 20th century who, kind of, I guess, discovered great truths about how the world works, but also their discoveries had a dark side, and they had they were used in sometimes in ways that, like in waging war and and things that were not so kind of not the intended use of their research. But at the same time, it was just this there was this kind of inner darkness associated with delving into these existential questions about our universe. And so what I found fascinating wasn't just the way the author delves into all these things, but just the way that he used fiction, because they read like essays, but then as you go on, you get more and more personal, and of course all of that is fictionalized, and so it just opened my eyes about what fiction could do and how you could play with form and create something truly astonishing.
It's interesting you mentioned maths and mathematicians. I was listening to an interview with Alan Garner and his recent book, the Treacle Walker, and he was talking about how he was out walking in the hills in England and with a mathematical friend, and his friend said something, and that set him off, and that sort of brings me to this notion of the question that I'm sure you're asked time and again, which is, where do you get your ideas from as an author? And sometimes the muse comes and sits by your shoulder, and sometimes a concatenation of events outside your control sparks something off and goes off. And Treacle Walker, I think, is a superb story, but so tell us about where you get your inspiration from, as well as it being your own personal experience at times. Where do you get your inspiration from?
I think more and more I have looked outward for inspiration. I think, it's interesting that you say, you get it from your own life, which I have. I think that's where a lot of people start, and you can't ever get away from that, from the stories and obsessions that you start with, like I became a refugee at 8, so I'm obsessed with that, and I will forever be obsessed with that. And so displacement stories kind of capture my attention. But, as I get older, I start to realize how important it is to look outward, to look in, other people's lives, the strangenesses and things that maybe are a little bit foreign to me, the struggles that are a little bit different from my own. And I think that looking leads to new obsessions. And I think at the end of the day, obsession is how you create great books. When the one that I mentioned at the beginning of this, as I was reading it, I was thinking about how the author, I can just see, he got obsessed with one mathematician's life and he couldn't stop researching. And then he delved into the inner world of that person. So I think for me, I try to find, new threads, new stories, new kinds of ways of looking at the world, and sometimes something sparks, and it's a new obsession, and then I go down that route, and I research it, I read, I talk to people, and somehow it always connects with my own experience. And I think that overlap, that connection, is always very rich with possibility.
Yeah, I mean, I was struck by reading your book about the commonalities and the if you like, the differences, and it brought to mind Tolstoy's quote about all happy families are alike and all unhappy families are unhappy in their own way, and that really struck home when reading your stories. And of course, as you say, the experience of being a refugee at such a young age, and of course the experience of your siblings and family, and how that helps shape the way you look at the world. But it doesn't, and increasingly, certainly what you've been saying is it doesn't define who you are. This isn't the stamp you've got. It might be a bit of, writing like Blackpool Rock going through you, but it isn't just who you are. And I'm interested in this development and change and growth that you have had as a writer. So can you tell me a little bit more about that? How you said about these obsessions that come to you, where do you get your sparks now that you have a family of your own? What's happening?
Well, I think it's interesting to think about, the various ways you define yourself at various ages. I mean, you're right in that, none of these particular labels or stories in my life can possibly define me as I get older. That's true of all of us, because we move, I guess, through life becoming more and more singular, hopefully, more and more singularly ourselves. So whereas, say, in my, teenage years, the being displaced or being, Iranian or refugee was just such a huge part of my identity. I kind of carried it around and you could see it. Then over the years, I added different things to that. And I think now in my 40s, it's the thing that I'm most interested in is exploring who I am singularly, not as a part of any particular group, displaced writer, Iranian, American, mother, whatever, but kind of as the very specific combination of those things that is me. Now, recent obsessions, I think they vary a lot. I'm in between projects right now, and I'm doing a lot of looking around and trying to find what I want to do next. I've been thinking a lot about recently women and their relationship with money. I've been thinking a lot, so I'm writing about that a little bit. I've been thinking, of course, a lot about what's going on in Iran, and the I guess women coming together in a place like that, kind of communities that I grew up in until I was 8 years old. I've been thinking a lot about, being a mother and what that means, what kind of a mother I want to be, what kind of on what I want to take from the mothers who raised me and what I want to leave behind. And I think that's been a particular, that's kind of occupied my mind a lot. What am I going to do to influence this little child, with all of her creativity and joy and I think when you take the combination of those things, you just kind of narrow down on something very specific. And I'm more interested in that now than I, than kind of any broad sort of.
Yeah. I mean, your Iranian background, if we want to foreground it, was really struck. Some of the questions that we were asking about the books that influenced us, and one of the things that when I left Iran at the same age as you, a few years before, I have to hasten to add, but the book I had with me on the flight coming over to the UK was Mahi Siyah Kuchulu, Little Black Fish, by Samad Behrangi, and it's a, of course, as a child you read it as a child's story. It's a lovely allegorical tale. As you grow older and as you enter your teens, you reread it and you see it as a political allegory, and it can be almost all things but as a simple child's book, as well as the pictures by the Farhad Miskari is glorious, but the story is so captivating. So I wanted to ask you if you, and by your response, the book as well, but are there any books from your childhood that you go back to that are almost like your comfort eating for the soul?
From my childhood, actually, yeah. I wouldn't say I go back to them. There was the children's books are that one, the little black fish, and then there was one called Are You My Mother? Do you remember that?
I do. I read it to my boys. I have 3 boys, and I've read it to each one. And I, depending on my mood, I change the gender. But yes, I do.
The thing is, did you ever read it in Farsi? Because the interesting thing is, they have that book in all kinds of languages, but somehow I think that the Farsi sounds so much sadder and sweeter than.
It does, and I think it's really interesting. I think that thing about the relationship between motherhood and childhood is obviously different in all cultures. There's lots of similarities, but you mentioned what's going on in Iran currently, and some of the most powerful things, as well as the most exciting and invigorating and joyful things, as well as seeing these young girls and boys out there, is seeing their mothers out there supporting them, and sometimes their grandmothers. And I'll be honest with you, it brings a tear to my eye as well as gladden the heart. So you're right about the differences in that, but also those similarities. So
Sorry to interrupt you, but
please.
I think one key difference has to do with language, because, if you think about that, it's like, are you my mother in English? In Farsi, it's, Shomaid madar man, it's in the formal version, like the plural, like the French vous, which you wouldn't, in French, you wouldn't use it to describe, it's more familiar, but in Farsi, we give our parents a respect of the formal, plural kind of form, Shomaid madar, and it's so sweet to see a little bird address all of these potential mothers in the formal, honorific kind of, way of the formal you. But I think those little changes in language also make a huge difference. It shows our culture, and the story translates.
Yeah. It's interesting you talk about translation or retranslation, and I mean, it's not my field. I know very little about it, so what I'm going to say is probably nonsense. But one of the books I've been reading is Grey Bees by Andrei Kurkov. And Andrei is a good friend of mine, and he is a famous Ukrainian author. Got to know him about Death and the Penguin. And he is Ukrainian, but wrote in Russian. And increasingly, he's writing in Ukrainian. And the translations of his books are really, really interesting. And I talked to him about it and how that changes. And so you have obviously seen translations of your books, and I know that you're fluent in dozens of languages. What control? That's loads. Look, don't knock it. What control, if any, do you have over the translations? Is it a work of collaboration, or is it because you know it? What do you do? Tell me about that.
I think it takes a ton of trust, because you can't possibly know, and it's not like you can have people vetting you have to trust the publisher. And I think there's a conversation that goes on between agents and editors about who the trusted, publishers are and who the translators you might want. But then, for me, I answer all the questions that they have about the particular meaning of something. But at the end of the day, I can't vet the language. I know, for example, my French, versions will be much thicker because French is longer, and it's got all those conjugations and things, but at the end of the day, I think, you kind of find out from the reviews in those countries. In some places, I think I must have just absolutely brilliant translators. In Germany, for my books do really well, and I can't help but think I must have gotten lucky. but I think in certain places, when you have a particular kind of influence in those countries, so for example, in countries that they maybe know a little bit more about Iranian culture, etc., maybe certain translations, maybe it's easier, or maybe it's there's, I guess, ways of communicating that is more, poetic, etc. I don't know. I guess the answer to this is that I don't get to be a part of that because I don't speak those languages, but I have to trust.
No, I think one of the really interesting things that's been happening in the world of publishing has been in translated works, is the fact that increasingly translators are taking and rightfully so, being given and accorded higher status rather than just a footnote translated by X. Often now in many publishing houses, they've got the name of the translator there. Talking of Germany, just moving on, segueing, you won the Geschwister Scholl-Preis for the book. What's it like getting these prizes? It's obviously a great accolade, and but where do you get the pleasure from? Do you get the pleasure from an ordinary refugee coming up saying, "You've told my story," or is it a work done? Tell me where the satisfaction is once you've finished typing or putting pen to paper. What what do you look for in your work, or is it done?
Well, to be honest, like the most of the pleasure actually comes from the process of the writing, just because, I mean, that's what I love to do. I think that's how I knew that this is the right thing for me to do, is because it's the only work where, you know, whatever the result, the work itself gives all of the pleasure. And, you know, kind of when I go out and dig into other people's stories and, you know, crafting the sentences, crafting the stories, finding like parallels and ways that I can kind of artistically put it together, that's just having my hands in it. That's really the joy. I mean, my life goes in such cycles. You know, there's those times where I'm just writing and I'm like a hermit. You know, sometimes it's just days and days in your pajamas, you know, just working and I get a lot of pleasure out of that, even though, you know, to an outsider it looks like I'm losing it. You know, because, well, you know, you're not eating anything, you're subsisting on coffee and you know, in those same pajamas. But you know, that's the joy for me. I love it. I love that process, and I love you know, researching and calling people and doing interviews and creating stories. Now, after the fact, though, you asked about after the fact. I think there's a lot of moments of great surprise, you know, surprising connection with other people. You know, people send emails and sometimes those emails are very moving, but in person, it's always nice. I remember once when The Ungrateful Refugee first came out, I was having an event and I was kind of, there was a big sign outside of a shop that said the name of the book. And I was talking to some people, and these three men walked in, and they are obviously newcomers from Afghanistan, and they looked at the title and they said, "What is this?" You know, and I said, I said, "This is for my book, you know, The Ungrateful." And they're like, "What do you mean, The Ungrateful Refugee?" And I suddenly realized, oh, this title does not explain itself. And I explained the book to them, and they were like, "Oh, so it's tongue in cheek, you know, you were a refugee." And I said, "Yes," and I invited them in, and they sat in and they listened. And afterwards, we had the most wonderful conversation about what it's like to be displaced, and about this phrase and what this phrase means and how it's been used against us, and, you know, setting up these expectations, etc. And a conversation like that with people who hadn't even read the book really was one of the great pleasures of having written it, because it sparked a sharing of our stories. Of course, I also love getting prizes, so it's nice.
Who doesn't? Everyone shall have prizes. It's fantastic.
It's nice that you get taken out to dinner.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'm really cheap. You know, anybody says something nice to me and take me out, not even dinner, a drink is fine for me.
Exactly.
I was struck by the title, The Ungrateful Refugee, and I think you raised some incredibly powerful points in it. As you say, on the title itself, I found fascinating, but I can see how it would affect people. You know, I don't want to push them on a political spectrum, but it reminded me very much of a book that came out a few years ago called "Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About."
I knew you'd say that one.
Well, it's true, because you know that the hackles of the people it's supposed to raise are raised. But you know,
that book is on
beyond that title, there are some deep, powerful messages that come across that, had it been an anodyne, you know, the Dina Nayeri story, with all due respect, might not have, you know, had the traction. So it was heartening to see that actually this is the beginning of a conversation. This isn't, you don't have the answers, you're there. So tell me about.
Also, I mean, I just have to say about a title like that is that this is a phrase that, if it weren't widely used, you know, I mean, the power comes from the fact that people use this phrase, and it's a phrase that nobody really thinks, why does the phrase ungrateful refugee exist? And the phrase, you know, the ungrateful, you know, I don't know, dentist, doesn't it? I mean, the fact is that we think refugees should be grateful. That's why the term ungrateful is attached to them. Whereas, you know, maybe other groups, we don't necessarily think that they should be particularly more grateful or display their gratitude or perform their gratitude for the sake of the other side. So I think the fact that the phrase is, you know, is widely used and exists is worth the conversation itself, you know?
Yeah, well, I think again, certainly in the US context, notion of the good immigrant, someone who comes along and helps the community, helps the GDP, helps the Republicans win elections. I didn't mean it to be that, but I think it's that, and I think one of the points that comes is because refugee in the modern context, and certainly since the Second World War, has a colour element to it, that putting aside the Jewish migration or the refugee experience in the Second World War, almost all, when you think of refugee, you think of a brown or black person, usually a man, increasingly from Muslim countries that have been in the conflict, blah, blah, blah. So, and that brings back our notions of race and class. And, you wouldn't be a refugee if you can afford, all these Russian oligarchs and the Chinese kleptocrats. They are as much refugees as you and I, but because they can buy, a £20 million house in London, they're not seen in the same way. So talk to me about race and class. You are of Iranian heritage, and I don't want to be disparaging from Isfahan, and so you have a funny accent when you speak Persian, but I'm from Kermanshah, so I'm from Kermanshah, so we don't take that. Tell me.
By the way, how recently did you live in London? Because there was a great restaurant there called Kermanshah, which is now gone.
Oh yeah, no, I don't have my mum and dad used to live in London, but my father passed away last year because of COVID. My mum's still there, but I only go and see her whenever I can. But I live in the north of England, in God's own acre in Yorkshire, so I don't need to go to London. So going back to identity and this gratefulness, one of the passages I like is about your evolution from, and we talked about identity and the multilayerality of identity. You're obviously a dirty foreigner who should be grateful for what they get. You moved to the States via Italy, but you're Christian. Oh, hold on. That's a bit of a dissonance going on. And, so tell me about the changes and what happened at that stage in your life, and, how you moved to this strange space. You're not white, you're not black, you're not.
Yeah, I think this kind of the different pieces of our identity were always kind of, it was very confusing, the way people reacted to each of them, but there definitely were crutches like the Christianity. So for example, when we first arrived, we were an Iranian family. We had nothing. We lived in a tiny, terrible apartment in a terrible, disenfranchised apartment complex. We had like two outfits each. We were very dark. You can't tell now by my bleached hair.
Looks lovely, by the way.
Thanks. The funny thing is that Iranian friends joke, "Oh, now you look more Iranian." But anyway. We like to play with color. But the thing is that we were kind of dark. My brother especially was, very dark, and we were arriving in Oklahoma right at the moment of, the Iraq War, right? The Gulf War. And it's not as if people really knew the difference between Iran and Iraq and, what are all the different political, conversations that are happening, the war between Iran and Iraq, like who is fighting with whom. They just thought of us as Middle Easterners, and we were the enemy in many ways. And so there was a lot of racism directed toward my family, to me in school, just having to do with like terrorism and things like that. There were a lot of horrible names and things that people used back then for Middle Eastern people that I would get called all the time. Obviously, there were particular physical features we had, that made us very obviously Middle Eastern. And all of that was incredibly difficult when combined with poverty, or not with not poverty. We always had enough to eat, but with just being poor, and looking shabby and looking like refugees. And so that time for me was very much about, how do I become American? How do I assimilate? How do I present more as an American? How do I get rid of this accent? How do I, dress more like them? Can I learn the cultural stuff that they've all grown up with really fast? Can I learn the shows and the music and the food just really quickly? How do we get the smell of korma sabzi out of our house? It's every Iranian kid's, thing, right? My house smells like korma sabzi.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now if I could just now I'm like, that smell in my kitchen makes me so happy. It's like the smell of like fried herbs and onion. Anyway, as when you're trying to assimilate, I think in 1990s Oklahoma, it's the ideas are very narrow, but like you said, because we were Christians and because we had become refugees, because we'd converted to Christianity and we'd been sponsored by a church and all that stuff, I think we clung to that. We clung to the idea that our Christianity makes us one of these people. And so there was this performative aspect to, our faith, as well as our, displacement, etc. And that usually came in the form of having to tell this story in church settings and Bible studies and, all of these places again and again and again. But my mother told it so many times. I told it so many times. I mean, by the time it came time to write a college application essay, I was like, the story I've been telling people. It was a burden that I didn't recognize then, because then it seemed to me like attention. And now it's like, well, you guys, I mean, why did you do that to us? Why did you make us perform this gratitude in front of all of these groups, instead of just allowing us to find ourselves again after all of that hardship and all of that trauma?
And what being a parent, I can see, what you have to do to what hoops you are almost willing to go through for the sake of your children, and this is not a reflection of your parents in any way, shape, or form. But looking back on it now, what I saw in my teenage years is demeaning behavior by my parents, and you're better than, and would make me angry. And not being mature enough, I take the anger out on them rather than the society and the situation that we found ourselves in. I did later on, and used to get into trouble for it. The Middle Eastern thing was interesting because I moved to the UK in the late 60s, and immediately-ish after, there was a migration, an expulsion of East Asian, from Asians, South Asians from East Africa, primarily from Kenya, Uganda, and to a lesser extent Tanzania. And so the news was full of these poor, benighted people getting off the train, getting off the plane in their saris and their finest gear, in the cold and the wet of Leicester or Luton or whatever. And a horrible slur that began to was the word Paki, P-A-K-I, as it has as much resonance, I would say, as the N-word does in American. And so there would be racists who would beat you up and call you the P word, and you'd be going, ow, 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 no, you have to get it right. Pakistan is next door. And these people are actually out while you're trying to give a geopolitical lecture to
exactly. Well, the funny thing is, like, when I was 6 years old, before we came to America, a couple of years before when we became Christian, we went to London, and I got called that, and they chopped off my finger. It's in the book. But the funny thing is, the same thing happened in Oklahoma. I mean, they would do this ching-chongese, at you. And I was like, wait a minute. I mean, I hate to correct the racism. It's like, you get the geography, this is not what, if you're going to make fun of Farsi, it should be the khuz and the khuz and the we do have things that you could potentially, but that's not it. And it's just the lack of education on every single level. I mean, but then you think, okay, it's important to just address the racism now.
Excuse me, that really is one of the funniest, and that was when I read that, it did make, I was drinking a cup of tea and tea spurted out of my nose, and this thing about look, I have no problems with you being a racist. Well, that's not the type thing. But if you are going to be, please, look, we don't say the word sound. Come on, pick up on that. We have some really funny phrases. Look at him. He's looking at me left. That's what you should be saying, not out.
So of course, the left thing, you have to speak Farsi. That's more insider stuff,
Exactly. But I was prepared. I was prepared to teach them, teach them how to be a proper racist. By all means, look, take the trouble. Don't just cloak it all in one thing. That we have far better racist terms for our neighbours than you could ever think of. And people within our own country. So, but very few of them took me up on that,
Exactly.
So,
you want kind of to bring in an Iranian grandma to be like, okay, people from Shiraz, people from Tehran, people from Isfahan, what do you call each of them?
Absolutely, that is what you want. Yeah. Look, it's been an absolute delight talking with you, and I know we could carry on talking for hours and hours, and inshallah one day we will meet, and I'll take you out for a meal, and you can take me out for a drink. I would like to take some time now to look at the Q&As, and we've had dozens here. So if you don't mind, I'll read out the questions, and if you could answer them, I'd be grateful. So the first one is from Anita Singh, and she asks, what do you think people fear the most when they see refugees?
Well, I think a lot of the fears have no basis in reality and have been planted there. I think people fear, having their culture replaced, having their jobs taken, having, the spaces shrink, and none of those things are actually, rooted in the reality of the numbers. People simply aren't coming over in the kind of numbers that would shrink your personal space and take away your specific job. But I think that the rhetoric on the other side has been so loud and so, and it's kind of successfully turned these very, disparate groups of people with all kinds of different stories and all kinds of different backgrounds into one, scary mass. Sometimes people don't even know what they're scared of. They're just scared because of the metaphors that have been used, the hordes, the tidal wave of refugees, the swarm, these kind of metaphors bring in images to our heads of like dangerous waves and bees and whatever else you might think of when you hear those words, but that's not what it actually looks like. And but I think, this kind of rhetoric is very good at planting the fear right into your subconscious. So you might not even be able to say what it's about.
Sure. So just a supplementary to that, whose responsibility is it? Is it the refugees to be grateful, to show them that you are more American than the Americans? Is it for you to hold the better 4th of July party to show them that they had nothing to be afraid of?
I don't think so. I think or is it the?
Oh, we're teasing. Yeah. So who bears the responsibility of challenging these?
Yeah. Well, I think it would be a shame to put all that responsibility on the displaced people themselves, because often they're not aware, of these things, and they are also carrying their own burdens of, shame, their own kinds of fears of not being accepted. I can't tell you what a huge burden the shame is, not just because you feel like you're somehow responsible for this displacement. Maybe it's, maybe whatever happened in your country, what was it, us, are we, worse at running a country? Is it me? Could I have handled things better? Maybe I could have been quiet and not gotten, not caught the regime's attention, whatever. I mean, there's all kinds of thoughts that go through a person's head when they've lost everything and they're coming and they need other people's help and they're afraid to ask for it. And they just have this general cultural and, personal shame that comes with all of that. So to put the burden of, proving that they are not harmful on them is really, it's sad. It's a sad thing to do. I think partially the responsibility lies with all of us storytellers, the media, scholars in the West, the people who, can advocate for them and say, look, this is not actually the truth of the situation. The world, all of the cultures of the world are built on periods of displacement and cultures mixing and creating something new and interesting, and we should be more welcoming. And also, there's no real threat here. And partially, I think it's local. I think at the local level of individuals and families, I think it's kind of just about placing all of your natural human responses maybe above all of those fears. And a lot of the most natural responses are actually the best ones. The curiosity that we have when somebody new comes in, the sense of wanting to welcome, wanting to get to know them, wanting to make them a part of our community. There is a natural response to that. So we should welcome it, and kind of not think so much, well, why is this particular person different from any other new neighbor? If a new neighbor came in and they weren't displaced, they had just come in because of a new job, what would we do? We would knock on their door, say hi, ask some curious questions.
That's true. Just a couple of questions about Iran at the moment. Ranveer Arora has asked, do you have any hopes for Iran, and that someday all of this will pass? This too shall pass, and things will return to normal. And a follow-on from that from Tanaz Shroff, who asked, if all were well with Iran today, after so many years of living away from your homeland, would you consider going back? So tell me something about what you think is going on currently, and whether any of it gives you hope for, if you want to, obviously, to go back at some time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, I would love to go back. I'd love to see family. I'd love to see Iran again. And there's particular things, like the climate landscape, so many things about it that I miss. The food, the music, the culture. The thing is that I think one interesting thing about your question is, in the first one, you use the word normal, and in the second one, if everything were well, what do those things mean, really? Because it's been 40 years, it's been 43 years, it's been my entire lifetime that we have had this particular regime, and do I hope that things will be better? I don't know if they can be under this particular regime, and I think they are very good at keeping power, because they always kind of give a little bit, enough to get people off the streets, and this is what has happened in uprisings past. So who knows what will happen? I do have some hope, that maybe in my old age I can go back. Maybe either even if the regime doesn't change, I think when I'm like 90, probably I'll be fine. I'll like slip under the radar. I'll just go and eat my fish in the north of Iran, and listen to some music, and no one will notice me there, maybe. But I don't know. I mean, I think all Iranians, I don't know, you can tell me now, there, like, you hold out hope. We all hold out a little hope. We all want to go back.
Oh yeah. I'm the eternal optimist. I think what is happening this time, for me, I've been around the block. I remember the pre-revolutionary times. I remember the revolution. I remember the horrendous war with Iraq. I remember the uprising. I remember the Green Revolution in 2009, and even 2 or 3 years ago in 2019. This feels qualitatively different, not necessarily quantitatively, but qualitatively. And the thing that gives me enormous hope is seeing these 12, 13, 15, 17-year-old girls. And this is in no way disparaging when I call them girls, because that's what they are. And it's wonderful. It's standing up, for something that is so pathetic, wearing a headscarf, forcing somebody, but obviously symbolically, and there they are with their hair flowing, and seeing their grandmas in cases.
Oh, it's so cool.
I think we've changed. I think there's a point now. Whether it will lead to bigger and better things, one can only hope. But I am hopeful. Just to talk about you, and you've got a little girl. What and you're, as well as being a refugee, Dina, you're a horrible hybrid of Iranian, American, French, British. This poor child. What is she taking away from this? How's she being brought up? Is she Iranian? Is she francophone? Is she anglophone? What are you doing to It's social services coming knocking at your door to take the child away.
Well, which social services would come, really? The thing is, you know, that thing that grandmothers and moms, Iranian grandmas and moms always tell us, which is like, you know, you're going to get a version of the same thing you're doing to me, you know,
Absolutely.
like that, I'm getting some real poetic justice, because when I was in Oklahoma, you know, obviously when we had first arrived in the US, and we had just been displaced for 2 years, I learned English fast, and then I changed my accent to an American accent very fast, and I was very judgmental of my mother for her English. I was mean, like, you know, and you know this instinct to be mean to our parents, so don't even look at me like that. So
me, I was the model son. Daughters do that. Sons are just wonderful.
Well, yeah. Well, my little girl is the queen of that, because when we lived in France for a little while, and she picked up French like that, and then I would try to speak French, and this girl, like at 4 years old, she's like, "Mommy, no, like, don't." She's like, "Don't speak French," and she's like, just openly embarrassed of my French, but I'm kind of proud to listen to her just pick up language so quickly. And, you know, there was a couple of weeks where we put her in an Iranian school, and she was like learning these little songs, you know, but her accent was very English. It was similar to yours.
God's own language, obviously. Another question I have here is from Rashmi Patak, and she's asked you about your book. There's the cover of your book has got a child in a gymnastic pose, but also looking at the world upside down. Did you have anything can we unravel the semiotics of that? What's
Wait, so you're talking about the waiting place now? Yes.
Yes.
So
my apologies. Yes, sorry.
Yes. So I was like, wait, gymnastics. Oh yes. So just for everyone else, this is the children's book that has come out this year called The Waiting Place, and it is about my you know, I visited these refugee camps a couple of times in Greece when I was writing all of these books, and I at one point I went back in order to just spend some time with the children to kind of capture their inner world, and to you know, write about what it is to be displaced and waiting. You know, the waiting place is this kind of monster that's always there. It changes your outlook on life. It changes kind of, it's all in the air and kind of in your pores, and it's part of the everyday. So this is called The Waiting Place. And the question was, you know, about the girl doing gymnastics and what, guess what that represents. I think for me, what's significant about her, and just knowing her and this girl and who she is that she did not let this atmosphere kind of alter her so quickly. I guess if you stay there for many years, you can't help it, but she kept her joy. A lot of those children kept their joy. They created a world for themselves in which they played and they read and they studied and they, you know, did cartwheels across this horrible little landscape, you know, and she would, and I think that made me, it just astonished me, and it just the resilience of these kids and their ability to make everything that they need for themselves in their little communities. I remember one of my best memories of that visit was as I was entering the camp, I saw a group of children speaking Farsi, you know, around a little one of those, you know, climbing structures. And I went and I kind of said, "Hi, kids," you know, in Farsi, and they all ran up and they're like, "Auntie." They immediately call you auntie, you know, like who are you? Exactly. And they wanted me to stay and play, and I told them, you know, I would come back. I had to go kind of check in with the charity and they said, and this little boy is like, "Okay, I will put you in my schedule for 4 o'clock." And I'm like, "What's?" Like, where's your calendar? It was wonderful. But I think for me, she represents just, you know, inner joy in a bleak place.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and I think you take away that, and again, trying to not wrap this up, but trying to pull these things together. I think that the central message I take away from your writing, both in the books and, you know, what I've read you in articles and things, is hope. Is that there is always hope. Sometimes it does look bleak out there, and bloody hell, it is bleak out there. But there is something about the human spirit that ultimately that's the thing that unites us as refugees, as immigrants, as ordinary people. That's it, that we have so much more in common, that getting beyond that label, that skin,
Exactly.
often brings joy to both sides, and joy multiplies joy. It's not confined.
It's true. I've never laughed so hard as when I'm sitting with a bunch of Iranians describing their first days, like out. Yeah, or describing some of the mistakes that they made, or some of the dark times. It's like you think of those times and you're like, this is so painful. But then I love, I don't know if you read this in one of my, I don't even remember where I wrote it, but like there was one time where I was sitting with a bunch of Iranians, and one group of them had just arrived, literally just arrived, and we were in a Mexican restaurant, and they kind of point to the guacamole, and we're like, what's that? The other guy's like, don't touch it. It tastes like Nivea cream.
Yes.
I laugh so hard at like these first tastes of things, and it's funny. People find a way to connect and have joy and laugh.
Absolutely. My similar thing to that was meeting a child who was friends of friends of friends, and it was only maybe less than a month that we'd been in the UK, and they'd been in the UK 2 or 3 days, and this little lad who was the same age as me, maybe a year or so younger, took me to one side and said that their toilets are horrible. I fell in, but of course he was squatting on the edge of the toilet, and he was shocked. How can these people, these Westerners who are so civilized, how can they be so barbarians? How do they balance on this? Why isn't it on top? And I had to take him and say, no, you're supposed to sit on it. Sit on it. Are you mad? What did they do? Julia.
I know. No, I gotta tell you, I don't know if this was true for you, but it took me 3 days, like to switch over to the Western toilet.
Well,
I can't believe we're being told, by the way, to wrap up on the whole toilet.
I know. Thing. And on that elevated note, on that highly, but not quite scatological note, can I take the opportunity to thank you so much, Dina? It's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you. I'm a huge fan of your work. I think you're an astonishing writer, and I would love to meet up one day. But without sounding pompous, your work is important. It's really, really important. As well as being joyful, more of it needs to go out there, not just for refugees and the affirmation, but the wider public. And from friends I've spoken with who read your work, they appreciate it as well. So thank you. That's a dad nakone. And I hope to speak to you soon. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for watching this interview with the amazing author, Dina Nayeri. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Nayeri and Dr. Fekri, for that difficult yet pertinent conversation. And of course, a huge thanks, as always, to you, our ever dedicated and faithful audience, for joining us today. Our next session online at 9 p.m. is Do the Right Thing: How to Navigate Ethical Conundrums with Susan Lioto, in conversation with Robin Banerjee. But remember, we aren't just online this year. Your favorite International Literature Festival is offline as well. For those of you in and around Bombay, remember to join us for our on-ground festival opening starting on Friday, November 11th, that's tomorrow, at the NCPA, and then again on Saturday and Sunday, besides the NCPA, at St. Paul's Institute of Communication Education and Tidal Waves Bookstore through the weekend, featuring writers and ideologues such as Gitanjali Shri, Shashi Tharoor, Mamang Dai, David Polonsky, Nandita Haksar, Manu Pillai, amongst so many others. Remember to check out our website, tatalitlive.in, for the full schedule of sessions and speakers. Tata Literature Live 2022 is in association with the NCPA, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Titan, powered by Godrej and Kotak. This session was sponsored by Godrej. The festival's social media handle across all networks is Tata Lit Live. That concludes our online session for today. But continue logging on to Tata Literature Live 2022, where we both can enjoy turning the page. Happy reading and good night.